Jon is going to talk about the wisdom of the crowd and decision aid choice. Thanks very much, Jon.
Thank you, David. I want to emphasize that this is joint work with my colleague Marlon Twyman at USC Annenberg. So with this paper, we are really hoping to set an agenda for making more connections between the wisdom of the crowd literature and empirical approaches to decision making. I often get to start these talks with fun examples about or of the wisdom of the crowd, but I'm going to assume you're all familiar with that, and instead say a bit more about how I think about the wisdom of the crowd in general terms. Like many people, I see the wisdom of the crowd not as something that is or isn't, but something to build. So really the question is not are crowds smart, but how can we make crowds smarter? What levers are available for us to do that? Axel's presentation already started to speak to that. I like to think of this in terms of Hong and Page's diversity prediction theorem. And most people's first intuition about how to improve crowd accuracy is to add experts to drive down the average individual error. So if the formula is average individual error minus predictive diversity, that's the group error. There it is mathematically. When we think about adding experts, what we're trying to do is to drive down the average individual error. It's not exactly clear what's going to happen to predictive diversity. You could come up with arguments either way, that by adding experts, you probably are going to affect it, but could go in either direction. Regardless, the sort of net effect, we certainly hope, is that we're driving down the group error by adding experts. Alternatively, you could try to add cognitive diversity to the group. Here we are actively trying to recruiting individuals who we believe would bring cognitive diversity, should drive up predictive diversity. Again, not exactly clear what might be happening with average individual error, but we certainly hope that changes in that second term are going to allow us to drive down the group error. But selecting your crowd is not an easy task, or in some settings, not something that you can really even do. So a lot of research has looked at different types of information aggregation and social influence processes. But on a high level, it's clear that outcomes there are sensitive to the precise process and constraints on it. All processes likely alter both the average individual error and predictive diversity, but each process might favor one over the other. So we'd hope that influence would help drive down average individual error, but frequently that means that we're going to be removing some of the predictive diversity. That might mean in total, we're still driving down group error, but not as much as we were driving down average individual error. That's one of our, I think, optimistic outcomes for aggregation and influence. However, it can go wrong where we do drive down average individual error, but predictive diversity is lost much faster, which is actually going to drive up the group error. In the worst case scenario, we have hurting groupthink behaviors where we're actually driving up individual error and driving out predictive diversity, and that's going to increase our group error substantially. These trade-offs really matter, and I'd go so far as to say that at the root of the wisdom of the crowd phenomena is the fact that any process that alters individual judgments starts a foot race between average individual error and predictive diversity. As long as the average error goes down faster than predictive diversity, the crowd's getting more accurate, but the relative rate of change here is really variable empirically. So when we think about how group processes, how they change group error, here are some results, recent results, showing that in some settings, social influence will reduce the group error, but in other settings, it can actually increase the group error. Ultimately, it can also depend crucially on the type of problem. I believe Joshua Becker's here, cited him quite a few times here. But it can really depend. So on a high level, there's a lot of variability in understanding who's going to win, that is the average individual error, and predictive diversity. Who's going to win the foot race between those two is not clear. I'm not in the business of trying to come up with a unified theory to explain the winners of that foot race between those two. And in fact, the goal of this paper is to open up a whole new area to look at and get a sense of how that foot race plays out. And that area is in settings that use decision support systems. So following others, we'll call this a macrocognitive approach to decision making. Scholars like Dewey, Simon, and March all emphasize that in real-world decision-making, we make choices by first seeking out information, including when to stop and exactly how to interpret that available information. So rather than thinking about how we as crowd designers and social scientists might improve individual accuracy, Marlon and I think we should start with the fact that individuals often try to do it themselves. Simon, as a progenitor of artificial intelligence, argued that healthy organizational processes should provide decision makers with the information necessary to improve our decisions. That push, in combination with increasing computational power, has led to a lot of decision support systems, which are basically any system that enhances decision making by bringing information and ways for evaluating that information to the fingertips of the actual decision makers. We prefer to use the term decision support systems, but very similar things can go by the names of expert systems, executive information systems, business intelligence systems, dashboards, key performance indicators, and any other kinds of names. To emphasize how different this approach to the wisdom of the crowd is, I would claim that the dominant view of the wisdom of the crowd is often one of private signals and networked influence. So here we have 7 individuals in some signal space, and they receive a private signal. Here it's all non-overlapping. They receive those signals, and then through the influence process, they share this information. When we think about a macrocognitive, macro-processual view of this, we have the same 7 people. They can still process their private signals, but socially we set up systems that aggregate a much broader range of information, do some processing, and then share that processed information back to individuals. So as decision makers, we rely on this information and the implicit or explicit frames that information is embedded in. To capture the combination of information and frames, we refer to those things as decision aids. So decision support systems provide decision makers with decision-making aids. We find this in a lot of different places. It does happen in public settings, and it has the potential to influence markets or voting behavior. But generally, we're more interested in private settings, so business analytics, internal dashboards, key performance metrics, and then a lot in human capital-based decisions. So our question is, what effect do decision support systems tend to have on group accuracy? Going back to how I broke this down here, when we think about decision support systems, these systems are designed to decrease average individual error. We are trying to make people incrementally better decision makers, but it has the potential to drive out predictive diversity. So these decision support systems can focus people's attention on specific aids and specific information. And if everyone starts to move toward using that aid and it's biasing their decisions in certain ways, we can be driving out predictive diversity faster than we're driving down average individual error. So it's not clear what this type of setting might do to group error. To put a little meat on the bones, I'll quickly walk through an example. If we start with a candidate here, this is a graduate student admission setting. Let's say that she has some objective quality score here, 93. In just a private signal setting, we might have 3 evaluators, maybe have conversations with her, and walk away with a score that they come up with there. The average score here is clearly off target. Maybe it's better than the population, but they really didn't have much to go on. It wasn't a structured decision-making process. We hope we can enhance it with decision aids. So here, things like GRE scores, letter of recommendation, statement of purpose, and so forth. Ideally, each evaluator would look at those things and come up with a corresponding score for that. Maybe they would reliably take an average of that. Based on that additional information that they have available, we see over here on the left that the group score is better. However, very practically, when presented with this much information and the need to make possibly many decisions, it's not clear that the decision makers are going to put equal emphasis on these different aids. And if you've sat through these meetings yourself, I think you'll agree that sometimes there are some people who will put a lot of weight on one particular aid and not others. So we should be thinking about this in terms of how people choose to attend to information here. With this first setup here, it's evenly weighted for everyone. That's how we get the average score of 92. But if everyone puts emphasis on the GRE, which is actually, a pretty reliable indicator on average, the error goes up. That's people attending to one specific thing. They can allocate their attention across. In this particular weighting scheme, that actually drives down the error nicely. But another option is just that people attend to different aids. And as I've set it up here, there's no group error. So we want to think about decisions around the first order decision, but then also what you need to do, what choices people make in attending to different information aids, or excuse me, decision-making aids here. So we set this up as a two-stage model. Starting with the second stage, the basic decision, individuals are going to be predicting criterion value. We're going to assume that at least some of them are error prone. And then focus on the first stage. So we let D equal some set of decision-making aids, and we let S sub J be a subset of those decision-making aids, so that the decision maker I is making a choice over what decision-making aids they want for self-exposure. And we're going to assert that people's predictions depend on what decision-making aids they have available and also which ones they choose to see. So with that in mind, those two stages, we need to break down how exactly information is influencing outcomes versus choice of information over that. To do that, we want to look at a null crowd that doesn't get any information aid treatment. That's the empty set. We're going to compare that to a crowd that is randomly assigned to one of the decision-making aids versus a crowd, the choice crowd, where people choose which decision-making aid. We'll actually look at both choosing just one and then choosing any number of them. And with those three different crowds, we can identify an information effect of a set of decision-making aids. That's just the error of the crowd with no exposure to the one with random exposures. And then a choice effect, being able to choose which decision-making aids you're seeing. That's the random crowd, the error of the random crowd minus the error of the choice crowd. And to start thinking through this problem, crowds are smart. We make the hypothesis, or we set ourselves up to test whether there's a positive effect of choice. We assert that people are actually, maybe they'll be pretty good at choosing which decision-making aids they should be looking at. So we're asserting that the choice crowd, the error of the choice crowd would be less than that of the random crowd, less of the one without any information. And we look at this experimentally with first a very simple bean jar task study. And what we do here is give them a set of 3 different aids to choose from. We came up with some aids that we're trying to engage a more rational approach, an intuitive approach, and then a mixture of both. And we give them a choice over which to see. The experimental design is all counterbalanced here. They have this stylized representation of what the aid is, and they get to choose in one setting, just one, in another setting, any number of them. Here are our results for that study. You'll see over here that when aids are assigned, the group does reasonably well. This line right here, the hash right here is the group average. It's a composite of the individual curves based on different things. So the equation aid does a pretty good job helping people, but you see a bimodal distribution. The comparison aid is very good. The crowd, however, does better once they are allowed to choose. So the basic shapes of the distributions for the individual aids doesn't change all that much, but as individuals move from being assigned an aid to having a choice of an aid, there are substantial improvements. When they have a multiple choice, it actually increases the group error a little bit. Breaking that down just a little bit more, here you're just looking at the, the average for the group average here, and we can see that the assigned as doing worse than the single choice. The correct number was actually 488 M&Ms in there, and some interesting effects that maybe we can return to. I know I'm running very short on time. So in this setting, aids can decrease individual error, but individually exhibit different average errors, but the choice of aid preserved diversity while still decreasing average individual error. And there's a bit of a case of Simpson's paradox in there, where within each treatment, they're actually getting worse, but overall getting better. We do this again with a pre-registered study predicting the CPI, the Consumer Price Index here in the United States. Without any information, they are okay at predicting what it will be. We ask them what it was for the last month before the figure is revealed. We have, again, a series of different aids that they can look at, and very similar dynamics here, where when the group is able to choose which aid they'd like to look at, they outperform the groups for which those aids are assigned. So in summary, these individuals, when given the choice to choose what to, when they are able to choose what aids they'd like to see, they do a very good job distributing themselves across them in such a way that they are preserving diversity while actually also decreasing the average individual error. So we think there are a lot of settings where this matters empirically. When you go into a business, there are all sorts of settings where you are aggregating a lot of information using decision support systems. And whenever a group decision-making element's involved, we should be thinking about this. Our preliminary results suggest that maybe individuals do a good job, but that was a very tightly controlled experimental setting. And certainly we'd want to look and see how it plays out in real world settings. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. And thank you to